The disparity did not go unnoticed in intelligence reports. Japanese scouts wrote of seeing Americans gathering around stoves, smoke rising above foxholes, mugs of coffee and soup in their hands. Prisoners, when interrogated, admitted that the enemy's abundance was devastating to morale. One even remarked, "We believed endurance was stronger than comfort. But your soldiers eat like kings while fighting like demons." It was a truth that shook the very foundation of Japanese doctrine. Because this was never just about calories, it was about philosophy. The Japanese high command had long insisted that spirit, Yamato Damashi, would triumph over material. Hardship was not an obstacle but a badge of honor. A starving soldier was proof of sacrifice, his suffering seen as noble. But on the battlefield, hunger is not honor, it is weakness. Starvation erodes muscles, slows reflexes, clouds judgment. Spirit alone cannot steady a rifle in trembling hands. Spirit alone cannot fuel a charge when legs collapse beneath exhaustion. The Americans, by contrast, embraced a different creed. War, to them, was not only about bravery but about systems. Food, fuel, ammunition, medicine, each was a weapon as vital as a rifle. To keep a man fighting, you had to keep him fed. That belief transformed the battlefield. American soldiers who huddled in muddy foxholes with bowls of soup were not indulging in luxury. They were proving the power of industrial warfare. The battlefield was not just men against men, but supply chains against starvation. The technical edge was immense. The American sea ration, mass-produced by the millions, included canned meat, biscuits, powdered soup, and instant coffee. Soldiers could heat meals with small fuel tablets or makeshift stoves. Even under bombardment, they found ways to eat hot food. Soup especially became a staple, easy to heat, easy to share, a morale booster in liquid form. Japanese soldiers, by contrast, had no such system. Their rations were not only smaller, but lacked warmth. Cold rice and dried fish could fill a stomach, but never soothe a soul. The psychological impact was devastating. To a Japanese soldier peering through jungle foliage, the image of Americans sharing steaming soup became a symbol of invincibility. How could men who lived so well under fire ever be defeated? Each spoonful of hot broth represented more than comfort. It represented an entire nation's ability to project power into the most remote corners of war. It was logistics as a weapon, morale as ammunition, soup as strategy. The battle for Manila ended in ruins, the city scarred forever. Yet for many Japanese who survived, one memory lingered more sharply than the thunder of artillery: the sight of Americans in mud and blood eating hot meals together. To them it was not only shocking but demoralizing, a reminder that they faced an enemy not only armed with guns but sustained by an endless flow of comfort and care. War is often remembered for its grand battles, its tanks and planes, its charges and defenses. Yet in the trenches of Luzon and Manila, the war was also decided by smaller things: a steaming mug, a shared spoon, a moment of warmth in a world gone cold. And in those moments the Americans revealed their hidden edge, one that the Japanese, for all their discipline and endurance, could neither match nor fully understand. April 1st, 1945. Okinawa. Dawn breaks with a grey light over cliffs scarred by weeks of bombardment. The sea behind the American lines churns with ships, their guns still glowing from the night's bombardment. Ahead lies a labyrinth of ridges, caves and trenches defended by the Japanese 32nd Army. For those men, food has become as scarce as hope. Rice rations are measured in pinches, sometimes stretched with grass and seaweed. Some soldiers, cut off in caves, resort to eating tree bark or scavenging from corpses. Hunger gnaws at them constantly, stripping away their strength and dulling their will. In American foxholes carved into the mud at the Shuri line, a different reality takes shape. Soldiers hunker down under the whine of mortar fire, yet within those trenches something extraordinary unfolds. Cooks and riflemen alike cluster around tiny stoves, boiling water in battered tins, pouring soup into cups dented from weeks of use. Steam curls upward, mingling with smoke from distant shell bursts. Men sip slowly, savoring warmth as their bodies brace for another day of combat. Soup, shared in silence or laughter, becomes more than food. It becomes ritual, resilience, resistance to despair itself. To Japanese scouts watching from hidden positions, The scene is unfathomable. Reports sent up the chain describe the enemy eating hot food daily, even under constant fire. Some Japanese officers refuse to believe it, dismissing it as exaggeration or propaganda. But the truth is undeniable. The Americans fight with full bellies, their morale sustained by an endless chain of supply ships, depots and field kitchens that stretch back across the Pacific. The contrast was staggering. Japanese soldiers on Okinawa received roughly 800 calories per day by spring 1945, barely enough to sustain life, let alone fight. Their rations, often rice mixed with millet or barley, shrank further as convoys were sunk by American submarines. By May, many frontline troops survived on less than half that. Malnutrition crippled them. Disease followed. Men wasted away in their positions, too weak to stand, yet still ordered to fight to the death. American rations, though hardly gourmet, delivered 3,700 calories per day. The sea rations included meat and vegetable stew, beans and franks, biscuits, chocolate, powdered coffee, even small packets of cigarettes. Field kitchens, whenever possible, supplemented them with fresh food shipped from supply depots. On Okinawa, barges and amphibious trucks carried crates of canned soup ashore, ensuring even frontline troops could heat meals. Soldiers cursed the monotony, yet they ate, and more importantly, they ate hot. This disparity carried immense psychological weight. For the Japanese, hunger was humiliation. The Bushido Code insisted that spirit could triumph over matter, but starvation eroded spirit faster than any shell. To watch Americans ladling soup in the trenches, laughing as steam rose from mugs, was to witness a different kind of warfare, one that fused industry with humanity. Each spoonful reminded Japanese soldiers that their enemy fought with more than weapons. He fought with the strength of a nation feeding him across an ocean. The disbelief grew into bitterness. Diaries recovered after the battle reveal shock at American abundance. One Japanese lieutenant wrote in despair, "The enemy eats warm meals while shells fall around them. We eat roots. How can we prevail against such gods of supply?" His words echo the sense of futility spreading through ranks already crippled by hunger. For Americans, soup was not luxury. It was strategy. The Quartermaster Corps had calculated that morale, as much as bullets, decided battles. A soldier who ate hot food felt remembered, connected, cared for. Even in foxholes, eating became communal, reinforcing bonds of brotherhood. One GI later recalled, "We were cold, wet and scared, but when someone passed me a cup of hot soup, I felt human again. That was enough to get back up and fight." This hidden edge transformed combat. On Okinawa, Japanese soldiers often launched night raids fueled by desperation, charging into American positions with bayonets fixed. The Americans met them not only with machine guns and artillery, but with the endurance of men whose stomachs were full, whose morale was intact. Hot soup in a trench may seem trivial, yet it was part of a vast system that kept American soldiers stronger, steadier, and more resilient than an enemy starving in caves. By June 1945, the Japanese defense collapsed. Hunger played its part. Starving men could not hold positions indefinitely, no matter their spirit. The Americans advanced, step by bloody step, sustained by supply lines that stretched back to factories in Chicago and canneries in New Jersey. On ridges soaked with blood, steam still rose from cups of soup, a small symbol of the industrial power that had followed every GI across the Pacific. For the Japanese who survived Okinawa, the memory remained searing. The shock of seeing Americans share hot soup in foxholes was not forgotten. To them, it symbolized an enemy who fought not only with weapons but with warmth, an enemy who never allowed hunger to dull his blade. It was logistics turned into morale, industry turned into survival, soup turned into victory. August 1945. The Pacific War gasps in its final throes. The mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki signal the end, but for the millions who fought in trenches, jungles and foxholes, the memory of how the war was endured lives on. In the minds of Japanese soldiers who survived campaigns from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, one image recurs with haunting clarity: Americans, even under fire, sharing hot soup in the mud. It was more than an oddity. It was a revelation of how two nations waged war on utterly different terms. For the Japanese infantrymen, The war was a test of spirit above all else. Hunger was expected, suffering was glorified, and sacrifice was demanded. Soldiers were taught that to endure starvation was proof of loyalty to the emperor. Rice rations, once plentiful, shrank as Allied submarines choked off Japan's shipping lanes. On distant islands, men died not from bullets but from hunger, their bodies wasting away in caves and foxholes. In their last moments, some wrote diaries, their words trembling with weakness, lamenting not only defeat but abandonment. They fought with courage but without sustenance, and courage alone could not carry them forever. The Americans, by contrast, never embraced starvation as virtue. Their war was fueled by an industrial machine of unprecedented scale. Millions of Liberty ships ferried tanks, planes, and fuel across the Pacific. But they also carried cans of beans, powdered soup, chocolate bars, and coffee. The quartermaster corps, often invisible to history, became the silent weapon of victory. Every foxhole stocked with soup, every trench where soldiers passed steaming mugs, was a testament to a philosophy that war was not won by willpower alone, but by feeding the will to fight. This difference did more than fill stomachs. It shaped morale. In muddy trenches, Americans laughed, cursed, and sang while passing cups of soup. That ritual of warmth tethered them to home, reminding them of mothers' kitchens, diners on small-town streets, and lives waiting across the ocean. It gave meaning to endurance. A man warmed by broth could fight another day, could stare into the chaos of artillery, and not feel entirely lost. The Japanese, watching from shadows, saw this, and could not believe it. For them, food was scarce, sacred, often consumed alone, and quickly. To witness an enemy feasting together under fire was like seeing an army of another world. The psychological impact rippled beyond the battlefield. Japanese officers interrogated after surrender admitted their shock. They spoke of soldiers demoralized by enemy abundance, of men whispering that America was invincible not just because of planes and tanks, but because of an endless supply of comfort. Some even confessed that the sight of Americans eating hot meals under fire convinced them the war was already lost. Logistics had crushed spirit, soup had broken steel. This legacy extended far beyond 1945. In the Cold War that followed, armies across the world studied the American system. NATO forces built doctrines around supply lines and morale, ensuring soldiers never fought on empty stomachs again. In Korea, in Vietnam, in the Gulf War, American troops carried forward the same lesson: feed the man, and he will fight. Starvation, once accepted as part of war, became recognized as a liability more deadly than bullets. Even today, in conflicts shaped by satellites and drones, the principle holds: the modern soldier, connected to supply chains stretching across continents, still finds resilience in hot meals shared in hostile lands. For veterans who lived through the Pacific, the memory of soup in the trenches remained vivid. Some recalled it with humor, grumbling about bland beans or over-salted stew. Others recalled it with reverence, describing how a single hot meal revived them from despair. And some spoke of the haunting gaze of Japanese soldiers captured or surrendering, men astonished by what they had witnessed. In the silence between battles, those eyes asked the unspoken question: how could men who lived so well fight so hard? The answer was written in the rubble of cities, in the wrecks of fleets, in the surrender signed aboard the USS Missouri. War had been decided not only by courage and sacrifice, but by logistics, by the simple act of ensuring soldiers could eat together in trenches under fire. The Japanese fought with valor unmatched, but hunger betrayed them. The Americans fought with abundance, and abundance sustained them. History often remembers grand strategies, decisive battles, and powerful weapons. Yet sometimes it is the smaller human details that reveal the deepest truths. In the Pacific War, one such truth was etched into the memory of friend and foe alike: the sight of steam rising from a GI's cup, of laughter carried over mud and fire, of soup shared in a trench while shells fell. It was more than nourishment. It was a message that America's strength was not only in steel and firepower, but in its ability to keep its soldiers human, even in the darkest places. It was proof that connection, comfort, and care could be weapons as powerful as tanks and planes. And in the end, that is the legacy. Field Marshal Keitel would later admit of Germany, We built better tanks, but you built tanks that work together. The Japanese might have said the same of food. We endured hunger, but you fought with full stomachs. The lesson is eternal. In modern war, as in the jungles of Luzon and the ridges of Okinawa, connection outweighs isolation, and comfort outlasts sacrifice. Soup in the trench was not just a meal, it was victory in liquid form. The Pacific War ended not with a single battle, but with a series of realizations, etched into the minds of those who fought on both sides. One of the strangest, most enduring memories among Japanese soldiers was not only the thunder of naval guns or the shriek of American dive bombers, but the quiet, almost domestic scene of enemy soldiers crouched in mud, laughing, smoking, and sharing hot soup while shells fell. It seemed impossible, an act of defiance against the very nature of war, and yet it revealed a truth that would shape the future of conflict for generations. The legacy of American trench soup was far larger than a steaming cup in the rain. It was a symbol of what modern warfare had become, industrialized, mechanized, and supported by supply chains that could reach across oceans. Where past wars demanded men sacrifice comfort, the United States proved that comfort itself could be a weapon. Soldiers who ate together, who warmed themselves with food that carried the memory of home, fought with a spirit unshaken by hunger. This was not indulgence, it was strategy, and it rewrote the rules of war. In the aftermath of surrender, Japanese officers studied this difference with grim fascination. Many acknowledged that their armies had been starved into collapse long before bombs or bullets broke them. The lesson was unavoidable. Spirit could not replace supply. The diaries of Japanese soldiers, filled with descriptions of gnawing hunger, stand as monuments to a philosophy that exalted sacrifice but ignored logistics. The Americans, with their endless crates of soup and coffee, fought with a balance of spirit and sustenance. That balance proved unbreakable. This understanding rippled outward in the decades that followed. During the Cold War, American doctrine emphasized not only firepower but what became known as morale logistics. In Korea, supply lines stretched across the frozen mountains, ensuring soldiers carried not only ammunition, but coffee and rations. In Vietnam, helicopters ferried not just troops but hot meals, reinforcing the same principle learned in the jungles of Luzon. By the time of the Gulf War, logistics had become so sophisticated that American soldiers in the desert ate fresh meals daily, while launching high-tech assaults under satellite coordination. The idea that a soldier could fight effectively without comfort was no longer even entertained. For veterans of World War II, the memory of those meals lingered. Many spoke of them not as luxuries but as lifelines. In oral histories, GIs described how the ritual of eating soup together created bonds stronger than steel. It reminded us we were still men, not animals, one veteran recalled. Another admitted, the food wasn't great, but it was hot, and when it was cold and wet, that was everything. These testimonies reveal the hidden truth. War is fought as much in the mind and spirit as it is on the battlefield. Food, warmth, and connection become as decisive as bullets. The Japanese, for all their valor, had no such stories. Their memories are filled with hunger, desperation, and the ache of fighting on empty stomachs. For them, war was a crucible of sacrifice, but one that consumed them utterly. To see their enemy, even under fire, eating hot meals together, seemed not only unfair but otherworldly. It was proof that they fought against a nation whose strength lay not only in steel but in sustenance. The lesson endures today. Modern militaries speak openly of network-centric warfare, where information and connection decide battles. Yet beneath the satellites and drones, the same truth remains: a soldier must be cared for, fed, and sustained. The battlefield may evolve, but the human heart remains the same. Soup in the trench, coffee in a foxhole, or a hot meal in a desert camp, these are not luxuries but pillars of resilience. In the Pacific, the sight of Americans sharing hot soup shocked Japanese soldiers because it shattered everything they had been taught about endurance and war. It was a revelation that spirit without sustenance falters, but sustenance strengthens spirit. In the end, it was not just tanks, planes, or bombs that secured victory. It was also the unseen hands of factory workers, the endless convoys of liberty ships, the steaming cups passed from one muddy hand to another. War is decided not only by the clash of armies, but by the quiet moments that keep men human amid the inhuman. On the ridges of Okinawa, in the jungles of Luzon, in the foxholes of Saipan, those moments came in the form of soup steaming in the rain. That image, seared into memory, outlived the war itself. It stands as a final, powerful lesson. In modern war, connection outweighs isolation, comfort outlasts sacrifice, and sometimes, victory is found not in the roar of guns, but in the steam rising from a soldier's cup. The convoy rumbled toward the rear, engines coughing as they cut across the scarred Norman roads. Dust trailed behind the American vehicles, cloaking the nurses in a haze that carried the acrid taste of gunpowder. Through the open slats of the trucks, they glimpsed scenes that felt unreal. Bulldozers carving wide roads, convoys of supply trucks snaking endlessly west to east, rows of Sherman tanks gleaming in the fading sun, waiting like patient predators, and then looming on the horizon, a sight that drew their eyes wide with disbelief, an enormous white tent city stretching farther than the eye could see. It was no village, no collection of field huts. It was an American field hospital, larger than anything these women had ever imagined, tents lined in perfect symmetry, marked with giant red crosses visible even from the air. Generators hummed, lights burned, and the steady rhythm of order contrasted sharply with the chaos they had left behind. For years they had worked in cramped basements and shattered railway stations, often without proper water, medicine, or sanitation. Now, as they were herded inside, they stepped into a world that seemed like a different planet. Inside, the air was clean. Rows of cots stretched in mathematical precision. White sheets, fresh bandages. The smell of antiseptic. Nurses in spotless uniforms moved with deliberate efficiency. Their movements sharp, trained, professional. Doctors barked, orders not in desperation, but with calm confidence. The Germans stared, unable to hide their shock. Their entire wartime experience told them this should not exist on the front lines of war. They had tended to soldiers in darkened cellars, where rats crawled among the wounded. They had seen men die not from wounds but from infection, from lack of medicine, from absence of morphine. And yet here, wounded Americans lay under electric lights, their vital signs monitored, their bodies cleaned and dressed with fresh linen. There were operating rooms with gleaming surgical instruments, stocked shelves filled with medicine, and even mobile X-ray machines humming quietly in corners. To these German nurses, it was like stepping into the future. The war had taught them scarcity. Bandages boiled and reused until they fell apart, needles sharpened on stones until they bent, medicine diluted, rationed, stolen from civilians when desperate. Every German nurse carried the scars of shortages, the moral weight of choosing which soldier would receive the last vial of morphine, which would be left to suffer. Now they walked through corridors where boxes of supplies seemed endless. Crates stamped U.S. Army Medical Department towered in neat stacks, promising relief and abundance in a war defined by hunger and deprivation. One German nurse, pale and thin from months of exhaustion, whispered to another in disbelief. "Das ist ein Krankenhaus? Im Krieg? This is a hospital? In war?" The question was not rhetorical. To them, war meant chaos, collapse, improvisation. The Americans, however, had rewritten the script. At night, the captured nurses lay awake on clean cots provided for prisoners of war. Outside, the floodlights bathed the massive medical camp in an unbroken glow, and the hum of generators replaced the silence of death they had known in their own shattered stations. They could not help but replay the images in their minds: electric suction devices, sterilized surgical theaters, entire wards staffed with more nurses than their divisions had seen in years. It was a vision of scale, of resources so vast, it bordered on the unbelievable. The shock went deeper than medical supplies. It was psychological, cultural. For years, the German propaganda machine had painted Americans as decadent, weak, incapable of enduring hardship. Yet here stood proof to the contrary. The United States had not only endured, it had mobilized on a level the Germans could not fathom. Every tent, every crate, every machine spoke of an industrial giant whose arteries pumped endless lifeblood into the war effort. The German nurses, trained to be stoic, could not hide their astonishment. They exchanged glances that needed no words. They were looking not at an enemy's hospital, but at the embodiment of a truth their commanders had never dared confess. Germany could not match this, not in industry, not in medicine, not in the ability to care for its soldiers on such a scale. Even the wounded German prisoners they passed inside the facility were changed by the experience. Instead of straw mats in barns, they were placed on proper cots. Instead of waiting hours in agony for attention, they were treated quickly, their wounds cleaned, their pain eased. For many, it was the first time in years they had felt human again. The nurses who had shared their suffering could see the difference in their eyes. Relief, gratitude, confusion. The war outside still raged with fire and steel, but within the walls of these American hospitals there was something else, an assertion of humanity amidst destruction. The captured nurses, stunned by its scale, recognized the deeper meaning. These were not just medical stations, they were symbols of American power, organization, and determination. And for those women standing silently in their white uniforms beneath the glaring lights, it was a revelation they would never forget. Here in the heart of Normandy, as the guns thundered in the distance and the wounded streamed in from the battlefield, the scale of America's hospitals had become a weapon of its own, one that shocked not only the German soldiers, but the very nurses who had lived through the collapse of their nation's war machine. By the summer of 1944, Europe was ablaze. The Allies had torn open Hitler's Atlantic Wall with the landings at Normandy, and the German Wehrmacht was reeling. In the east, the Red Army drove relentlessly westward, pressing the Reich's armies back across the rivers and plains of Poland. In the west, American, British, and Canadian divisions clawed through hedgerows, pushing toward Paris. Yet within this broader storm of steel and fire, another war raged in silence, the war of logistics, medicine, and endurance. For Germany, the contrast could not have been sharper. The Reich had entered the conflict believing in short, decisive campaigns, blitzkrieg, lightning war. Its military planning had been built on the idea of speed, overwhelming shock, and rapid collapse of enemies. That doctrine had produced stunning victories in 1939 and 1940, but by 1944, it had left the German system hollow. The armies at the front were still powerful, but they were brittle, stretched thin, bleeding without enough resources to replace what they lost. The hospitals behind German lines reflected this reality, underfunded, overworked, and perpetually short of supplies. The Americans, by contrast, had prepared for something very different. They entered the war late, but when they did, they entered with the full weight of their industrial arsenal. Factories in Detroit, Chicago, and Pittsburgh did not simply build tanks and planes. They produced bandages by the ton, penicillin by the gallon, and field hospital kits that could unfold like entire cities in canvas. Their doctrine assumed a long war, a global war, and a war that would require taking care of hundreds of thousands of men wounded far from home. By 1943, as the fighting shifted from the deserts of North Africa to the mountains of Italy, the Americans had already revealed a glimpse of this capacity. In Tunisia, captured German officers marveled at the endless streams of trucks and mobile kitchens that accompanied U.S. infantry divisions. They had dismissed America as soft, incapable of true endurance. Yet in Africa, they saw soldiers fed hot meals, supplied with clean water, and treated for wounds in conditions that seemed unimaginable compared to their own dusty aid stations. That same year, as American bombers flew deeper into Europe, downed airmen spoke later of being rescued by medical units that could operate with precision under enemy fire. Germany's system, meanwhile, was crumbling under its own weight. Allied bombing raids had devastated factories and rail lines, making the transport of supplies a daily struggle. Nurses and doctors improvised constantly, tearing sheets from civilians to make bandages, relying on outdated surgical tools, and fighting infections with dwindling stocks of sulfur drugs. In the East, conditions were catastrophic: freezing temperatures, typhus outbreaks, and frontline hospitals barely able to function. Nurses became not only caregivers but scavengers, begging for supplies from local populations, or simply praying that a shipment might arrive before more men died. And yet in Berlin, the illusion of strength persisted. Propaganda painted Germany as resilient, unbroken, capable of resisting the enemy forever. Soldiers at the front were told that the Americans were fragile, unwilling to take casualties, incapable of withstanding the brutality of mechanized war. But the truth was already visible to anyone who glimpsed the enemy's medical infrastructure. American hospitals, even in the field, radiated a sense of abundance. Germany's hospitals radiated despair. The difference was not merely material, but cultural. In the United States, the war effort had mobilized scientists, doctors, and corporations on a scale the world had never seen. Universities poured resources into research. Pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer and Merck churned out penicillin in industrial quantities, transforming medicine almost overnight. The average American soldier entering combat in 1944 carried the silent guarantee that if he was wounded, he would be treated with the best science, the best doctors, and the best equipment his nation could provide. For German soldiers, the guarantee was far less certain. Many still fought with courage, still trusted their comrades and their field medics. But they knew that a serious wound often meant a slow death. Nurses worked themselves to collapse. Yet no amount of dedication could overcome the shortages strangling the Reich. The captured German nurses who walked into American hospitals in Normandy had lived this truth. They had stared at the faces of dying men, knowing they lacked the tools to save them. When they saw crates of morphine in US hospitals, it was not simply abundance they saw. It was the power to spare suffering on a scale they had never known. The strategic situation in 1944 only amplified this divide. The Allies were not only advancing in France, but also tightening the noose on Germany's industrial heartland. Oil was scarce, ammunition was rationed, replacement tanks rolled out slower than they were destroyed. And behind this shortage stood the reality that the Reich could not supply its own medical system adequately. Trains carried weapons, not bandages. Fuel went to tanks, not ambulances. Every decision made in Berlin favored the front line over the rear, but by 1944 the rear was collapsing. The wounded flooded in, and there was nowhere to put them. It was into this reality that those captured nurses were thrust when they saw America's medical cities rising from French fields. To them it was not simply a contrast of medicine, it was a revelation of war itself. Their own commanders had told them Germany would endure, but endurance required supplies, factories, and organization on a scale that America had mastered and Germany had lost. By the end of 1944, this truth was undeniable. In the Ardennes, during the Battle of the Bulge, German medics begged for supplies while American divisions, even under siege, managed to keep their wounded alive with portable surgical units and airdropped medical kits. Nurses who once believed in the Reich's strength now understood its fragility. The contrast between German scarcity and American abundance was no longer hidden. It was a daily, living reality. The historical context of this moment explains why the shock of those captured nurses ran so deep. They were not simply astonished by clean cots and electric lights. They were astonished because everything they had lived through told them this was impossible. War to them was ruin, improvisation, and collapse. Yet the Americans had built hospitals in the middle of battlefields that looked like cities of mercy. The broader war had created the stage. Their astonishment was the reaction to the sheer gulf between two nations fighting the same war but on utterly different terms. The revelation did not come with the thunder of guns or the crash of armor, but in the hum of generators, the clatter of sterilized instruments, and the quiet rhythm of voices carried over clear radio channels. For the Germans, accustomed to a world where scarcity dictated every decision, the hidden advantage of the Americans was not a new weapon of destruction, but a weapon of preservation. It was scale, it was organization, and above all it was the ability to move medicine, supplies, and knowledge with the same efficiency as tanks and artillery. The captured nurses could not fathom the abundance before them. In their world, a shipment of morphine was a rare prize, its vials counted and guarded, its use rationed with grim calculation. A box of bandages was a treasure, a functioning X-ray machine was a miracle. And yet here, in the heart of Normandy, the Americans had not one machine but dozens, humming under bright lights, powered by portable generators that filled the air with a constant steady growl. Where Germans had carried stretchers down muddy roads in the dead of night, the Americans used fleets of ambulances, their headlights piercing the darkness, their sirens cutting through the chaos. This was the hidden advantage. the industrial power of a nation that had turned its factories not only to war but to the preservation of its warriors. While Germany poured dwindling resources into new tanks like the Panther and Tiger, America invested equally in morphine production, blood plasma, surgical instruments, and field hospitals designed to unfold like machines of mercy. The German High Command underestimated this completely. They calculated American tank production, shipbuilding numbers, aircraft assembly. They never grasped that America's medical infrastructure was itself a weapon, ensuring that every man pulled from the battlefield had a far greater chance of returning to fight again. The radios reinforced this advantage. The German nurses, stunned by the vastness of the American hospital, noticed the chatter of voices on field telephones and the crackle of FM radios transmitting orders across the compound. Within minutes, ambulances rerouted, surgeons were summoned, supplies were requested. It was a seamless system, powered by technology the Germans could scarcely replicate. In their own hospitals, communications were slow, reliant on runners, messengers, or fragile phone lines easily cut by shellfire. Delays killed, confusion reigned. In the American system, clarity flowed like electricity. The shock to German nurses was more than material. It was existential. They realized that what they had been told about their own superiority was a lie. The Reich promised that German science was unmatched, that its doctors and engineers stood at the pinnacle of modernity. And yet here, on French soil, they found themselves walking through facilities that eclipsed even the largest hospitals in Berlin. One German nurse later admitted, with bitter astonishment, that the American hospital looked like a city, not a camp. She spoke of corridors lined with endless supplies, of surgeries that could be performed simultaneously on dozens of men, of entire wards lit as bright as day in the middle of a war zone. For the Americans, this was not indulgence, it was doctrine. General George Marshall, architect of U.S. strategy, had insisted that the strength of an army was not only in how many men it fielded, but how many it could save. Every wounded soldier treated quickly and effectively was not just a life preserved, it was morale maintained, fighting power restored, a testament to the promise that no man would be abandoned. The Germans, clinging to dwindling resources, could not offer the same guarantee. Their soldiers fought with courage, but carried in their hearts the silent dread that a serious wound meant slow death in a barn or basement. The nurses felt this most deeply because they had lived it. They had watched comrades collapse not from lack of skill, but from lack of supplies. They had held men's hands as fevers raged, knowing antibiotics that could save them existed, but were out of reach. They had fought infection with boiled rags and whispered prayers. Now they watched American nurses wheel machines into position that could see into broken bones, pump oxygen into failing lungs, or transfuse blood drawn from a system of donors spanning an entire continent. It was as though the Americans had harnessed the nation itself as a hospital, transporting its heartbeat across the ocean. The Germans tried to explain it to themselves. Perhaps it was decadence. Perhaps it was waste. Perhaps it was simply a temporary abundance, soon to collapse under the strain of war. Yet the longer they remained in American custody, the clearer the truth became. This was not temporary. This was systemic. This was a machine of war as powerful as any panzer division. The hidden advantage was not merely in weapons, but in the infrastructure that sustained men through the horrors of battle. Reports filtered back through German prisoners, and even among officers there was disbelief. Tales of American hospitals the size of villages, of endless supplies, of mobile X-ray units and surgical tents that seemed like illusions. Some dismissed it as Allied propaganda, others suspected exaggeration, but the nurses who had seen it with their own eyes carried the memory with a quiet certainty. They had walked through those corridors, they had heard the steady hum of generators, and the calm voices of doctors commanding teams, as if conducting an orchestra. They knew it was real. The hidden advantage was not the product of battlefield brilliance, but of preparation. While Germany gambled on lightning victories and collapsed under the weight of attrition, America prepared for endurance. It prepared for the wounded, for the long haul, for a war of months and years rather than weeks. And in doing so, it created something that stunned its enemies not with firepower, but with mercy delivered on an industrial scale. To the captured German nurses, the realization was devastating. They were trained to be stoic, to endure suffering, to carry the burden of scarcity without complaint. Yet walking through the American hospitals, they were confronted with the reality that their suffering had been unnecessary, at least unnecessary for those whose nations could prepare as America had. In the glow of floodlit tents, they saw the hidden advantage revealed, not in secrecy, but in plain sight. It was not a new weapon of war. It was a new vision of what war could be when a nation's entire machine bent not only to killing but to saving. The scale of America's medical war machine could not be understood in vague impressions alone. To grasp its true power, one must descend into the details, the specifications, the numbers, the very engineering that turned canvas and steel into cities of survival. Where the German field hospitals were starved skeletons of improvisation, the American field hospital was a carefully engineered organism, designed to expand, contract, and breathe with the rhythm of battle. At its heart was the Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, or MASH, a concept born of necessity and perfected by American industry. Unlike Germany's small and static field stations, the MASH was a living system, capable of being dismantled, transported, and reassembled in hours. Each one unfolded like a mechanical flower, its canvas petals stretching across open fields, its veins fed by supply lines that reached back across the Atlantic. A single unit carried enough equipment to treat hundreds of wounded men per day. Generators powered not just lighting but refrigeration units for blood plasma, a life-saving innovation that transformed wartime medicine. The plasma, stored in glass bottles or later in sealed containers, was flown in by the ton, ready to restore life to soldiers who in previous wars would have bled to death. The Germans had no such abundance. Their medical corps, strained by shortages and blockades, often had only whole blood transfusions available, and even those were limited to when compatible donors could be found. The Americans had solved the problem with scale and logistics by building a global system of blood banks that stretched from New York to Normandy. The instruments told their own story. German surgeons often worked with tools from the 1920s, sterilized and reused until they dulled. American hospitals unpacked crates of gleaming stainless steel scalpels, clamps, and retractors, each wrapped in sterilized paper, each one ready to be discarded or re-sterilized after use without fear of shortage. The difference was not one of skill. German doctors were often highly trained, but of supply. A surgeon's hand could only be as steady as the tools he was given. Then there were the radios. The SCR-508, the backbone of U.S. armored communications, weighed 181 pounds and delivered 25 watts of crystal-controlled power. It provided clarity across miles of battlefield, immune to the static that plagued German amplitude-modulated Fugue 5 sets. In a hospital setting, the difference was revolutionary. Orders moved instantly. Supplies could be rerouted mid-convoy. A wounded soldier's arrival could be announced minutes in advance, giving doctors precious time to prepare operating rooms. The Germans, relying on erratic lines or runners, lost those minutes, and with them lives. Even the tents themselves spoke of innovation. The standard U.S. Army hospital ward tent, the pyramidal tent, or later the general-purpose medium, covered nearly 600 square feet, large enough to house dozens of cots. Its design allowed for rapid erection and efficient heating. Germans often resorted to barns, churches, or commandeered civilian structures, spaces never designed for medicine, often dark, damp, and impossible to sterilize. The Americans had created hospitals from the ground up, engineered for war rather than borrowed from civilians. Pharmaceuticals were another silent battlefield. By 1944, American factories were producing millions of doses of penicillin every month, flooding Europe with the first true antibiotic. Infection, once the great killer of war, could now be stopped in its tracks. German nurses had no such miracle. They relied on sulfur drugs, effective in some cases, but far less powerful. When captured nurses saw shelves stacked with vials of penicillin, they understood that this was more than medicine. It was a revolution. Soldiers who would have been lost to infection under German care now rose from their cots within days. Numbers painted the starkest picture. The U.S. Army Medical Department employed over 600,000 personnel by 1945. Doctors, nurses, medics, technicians. Its hospitals ranged from the smallest aid station, capable of treating a handful of wounded, to the sprawling one, 1,000-bed general hospitals constructed in England and France. A single American general hospital could handle more patients in a week than some German divisions could in a month. Supplies moved in vast streams in 1944 alone. The US shipped over 300,000 tons of medical equipment to Europe. Germany, under blockade and constant bombing, could barely move a fraction of that. Factories fueled this torrent. Motorola and Western Electric produced radios by the tens of thousands. Pfizer pioneered deep tank fermentation, turning penicillin from a laboratory curiosity into an industrial product. Ford and GM diverted assembly lines from automobiles to ambulances, rolling out vehicles by the hundreds. Detroit, once the capital of cars, became the capital of wartime logistics, its plants feeding not only tanks to the front but also the lifeblood of medical care. Even the humble stretcher revealed the chasm. American litters were mass-produced with collapsible aluminum frames and canvas strong enough to endure dozens of evacuations. German stretchers were often improvised from wooden poles and blankets. One German nurse recalled how, during the retreat from Kiev, she and others carried men on doors ripped from peasant huts, their blood soaking into rough wood. When she later saw the neat rows of American stretchers stacked in endless supply, she realized the gulf between improvisation and preparation. The captured nurses noted details others might overlook. Clean linen changed daily. Soap available for every ward. Hot water running through portable boilers. Small comforts, but each one symbolized a larger truth. America had mobilized not just to fight but to sustain. To the Germans, who had long since abandoned such luxuries, these details carried almost unbearable weight. They were not trivial. They were the line between dignity and despair. The German medical service, for all its dedication, had been crippled by a leadership that prized offensive weapons above human endurance. America, by contrast, treated endurance itself as a weapon. In the numbers, in the engineering, in the specifications of radios, tents and plasma bottles, the hidden strength of the US war machine became visible. The nurses who had once believed in Germany's medical prowess now confronted undeniable proof that their enemies' hospitals were not only larger, but technically superior in every measurable way. The sight of a generator powering an entire ward meant more to them than any tank rolling across a battlefield. It was proof that America's true advantage lay not in destruction alone, but in the ability to heal, and to heal on a scale so vast, it seemed almost inhuman. September 19th, 1944. The rolling fields near the French village of Aricourt were shrouded in morning mist, heavy with the smell of damp earth and oil. German armor, 39 Panther tanks and their supporting vehicles, lay concealed among the hedgerows and tree lines, engines rumbling low, awaiting the order to strike. Their crews were veterans of the Eastern Front, men hardened by years of brutal fighting against the Red Army. Across the fields, unseen in the haze, the Americans prepared for battle with something the Germans had not anticipated, a system that allowed them to fight as one organism, to strike with coordination that seemed supernatural. The tanks were not alone. Behind them stretched a medical lifeline that gave their crews confidence, a knowledge that wounds would not mean abandonment but survival. When the German panzers surged forward, the thunder of their engines shook the ground. The Panther's long 75 mm guns barked, shells streaking across the fog-shrouded fields. Explosions tore through the earth, sending dirt and smoke skyward. American Shermans darted in and out of cover, their coordination uncanny. Orders rippled across radios, not just to the tank commanders, but to the infantry, the artillery batteries, and even the medics waiting just behind the lines. Within minutes, wounded men were being carried to aid stations already braced for the influx, thanks to radio reports that had warned them in advance. German reports later described the experience with bewilderment. Panthers would advance into open fields, only to find American tanks vanishing behind smoke, reappearing on flanks, moving with a speed and cohesion that defied explanation. More astonishing was the rapid recovery of American units. German intelligence had expected attrition to cripple their opponent, but instead, men hit by shrapnel one day were seen returning to duty within weeks. The secret was not mystical. It was medical. America's vast hospital system, operating just behind the lines, turned crippling losses into temporary setbacks. As the battle raged, American artillery pounded the German positions with precision. Wounded GIs were dragged to safety, blood staining their uniforms. Within minutes, medics stabilized them with plasma transfusions drawn from refrigerated units kept humming by portable generators. Jeeps converted into ambulances whisked them to surgical tents where surgeons stood ready. In Aracourt alone, hundreds of men were treated within the first 24 hours, many saved from wounds that in previous wars would have been fatal. German nurses, captured later in the region, would recall their disbelief at the sheer speed of evacuation. In their experience, the wounded might lie for hours, even days before reaching a doctor. Here it was a matter of minutes. The German commanders noted the psychological effect. American soldiers fought with a confidence that came not only from firepower, but from faith in the system behind them. They knew they would not be abandoned. They knew that if they fell, a chain of care would catch them, carry them, and mend them. German soldiers, by contrast, carried a darker knowledge. They fought bravely, but they understood that a wound could mean the end. Their hospitals were distant, under-equipped, and collapsing under the weight of Allied bombing campaigns. Morale sagged under this invisible burden. In the chaos of Aracourt, Panthers burned. German crews bailed out of blazing machines, only to be cut down or captured. Those who were wounded discovered a bitter irony. American medical units treated them with the same speed and care given to their own men. Prisoners were carried into sprawling surgical wards, their eyes wide at the floodlit tents, the sterile instruments, the endless supplies. Some wept openly, not from pain, but from the shattering realization that their own comrades still languished in barns and basements across occupied Europe. Reports after the battle painted a grim picture for Germany. Of the 39 Panthers committed, more than half were destroyed or disabled. American losses were heavy but sustainable, precisely because their medical system could absorb the blow. The after-action analysis revealed kill ratios skewed in America's favor, not simply because of tactics or machines, but because wounded Americans returned to the fight while wounded Germans vanished forever from the battlefield. For the German nurses captured during the retreat, Aracourt became a revelation they could not forget. They had seen their own wards overwhelmed by casualties, their hands trembling from exhaustion, their spirits broken by the cries of men they could not save. Now they saw Americans transforming farmland into hospitals that functioned with the efficiency of factories. Rows of operating tables worked in shifts, sterilizers hissed, and nurses moved like clockwork under the harsh glare of floodlights. To them it was not merely impressive, it was terrifying. The battle itself became a case study in contrasts. German armor, technologically advanced and deadly, had been expected to dominate, but technology without infrastructure faltered. The Panthers, for all their power, could not overcome an enemy that fought as a system, tanks linked to radios, radios linked to medics, medics linked to hospitals. Each link ensured that the American war machine could endure losses that would have shattered another army. As dusk fell on Aracourt, the fields lay littered with twisted steel and scorched earth. Smoke curled into the evening sky, mingling with the cries of the wounded. For the Americans, the battle was a victory, hard fought but decisive. For the Germans it was a disaster that revealed a truth they had long tried to deny. The United States was not merely another opponent. It was an industrial giant whose strength lay not only in the number of tanks and planes it produced, but in the invisible network of care that kept its soldiers alive. Captured German nurses would later describe Aracourt in hushed tones, recalling how they watched Americans pull the wounded from the mud and restore them under electric light, while their own comrades died in darkness. The contrast was so stark it felt like two different centuries colliding on the same battlefield. For them it was not just a defeat of arms, but a defeat of faith, a collapse of the belief that Germany could endure against such an enemy. Aracourt was more than a clash of armor. It was proof that hospitals, no less than tanks, could decide the fate of armies. War is not only a contest of guns and steel, but of minds and spirits. By 1944, the battlefield advantage enjoyed by American hospitals had grown into something far greater than the sum of its tents, cots, and surgical tools. It was a weapon that shaped strategy and shattered psychology, turning the very idea of war into something different for the men who fought it. For the American soldier, the knowledge was simple but profound. He would not be abandoned. When he charged across open ground, when he crawled through hedgerows under machine gun fire, when shrapnel tore through his body, he carried with him an unspoken confidence. Behind him, stretching all the way to the beaches of Normandy and across the Atlantic to the factories of America, was a chain of care. Field medics with plasma packs, jeeps converted to ambulances, clearing stations ready with surgical teams, evacuation hospitals with rows of clean beds. Each link in the chain whispered the same promise: you will live. That promise was more than comfort. It was strategy. A man who believed he would be saved fought with greater ferocity. He pressed forward, knowing that the risk of death was tempered by the likelihood of survival. In the foxholes of France, that belief was as valuable as any rifle. American commanders understood this, even if their soldiers did not articulate it. Morale was not built on speeches alone. It was built on systems that proved themselves in the darkest moments. For the Germans, the opposite truth gnawed at them like a hidden wound. Soldiers whispered among themselves that being hit meant doom. They had seen comrades carried to barns where candles flickered over crude tables, where exhausted nurses fought infection with little more than boiled rags. They knew that men who might have survived in another army died slowly in theirs. That knowledge hollowed them. Even the bravest men, when confronted with the likelihood of abandonment, carried a shadow of despair into battle. The nurses felt this duality most deeply. American nurses worked with confidence, supported by endless supplies, clear communication, and the certainty that reinforcements would arrive. German nurses lived with dread. Every patient was a test of improvisation, every shortage a moral wound. They bore the unbearable burden of choosing who would receive the last vial of morphine, whose life could be spared, and whose would end in agony. Such choices scarred them as surely as combat scarred the men in trenches. When they saw their American counterparts treating dozens of men simultaneously, with trays of supplies at hand, the psychological blow was devastating. Even German officers recognized the larger strategic impact. Reports captured after the war revealed their astonishment at how quickly American divisions recovered from battles. A unit mauled 1 week would return to the line reinforced not just with replacements but with its wounded restored. This resilience baffled German planners, who expected attrition to grind the Americans down. Instead, the opposite happened. The Americans seemed inexhaustible, their losses replenished by a machine that treated survival as efficiently as it produced tanks. The psychological toll on German crews was immense. Tank commanders, already fearful of the endless streams of Shermans and Thunderbolts overhead, now realized that even when they inflicted casualties, their enemy recovered too quickly. A wound was not a victory. A destroyed tank was not the end because its crew might be back within weeks. To fight such an opponent was to fight despair itself, a despair that drained German strength long before bullets or shells struck. The Americans also understood the value of communication in maintaining this psychological edge. Radios did not simply connect tanks and artillery. They connected hope. A soldier knew that when he called for help, it would come. A medic's voice crackling over the air was proof that he was not forgotten. German soldiers, cut off when their radios failed or their command tanks were destroyed, felt isolation seep into their bones. That isolation was a weapon more deadly than any rifle. Captured German nurses, forced to confront this reality, often spoke of humiliation mixed with awe. They described walking through American hospitals that glowed like cities in the night, where the wounded rested under electric light, while their own hospitals lay in darkness. They confessed that the sight broke something inside them, not only their pride, but their faith in victory. They had been told that German science was unmatched, that their nation was invincible. The truth unfolded before them in rows of cots, in humming generators, in the simple fact that American soldiers fought with the knowledge they would live, while German soldiers fought with the fear they would die unseen. Strategically, the impact was immense. Campaigns that might have ground to a halt for another army surged forward under American momentum. The Normandy breakout, the drive across France, the bitter struggle in the Ardennes. In each, the ability to sustain losses without collapse was decisive. German divisions crumbled when command posts were destroyed or hospitals overrun. American divisions absorbed punishment, healed, and advanced again. Psychologically, it reshaped the war. German morale eroded not only from battlefield defeats, but from the realization that their enemy endured in ways they could not. American morale soared, not only from victories, but from the quiet assurance that survival was more likely than death. This invisible war of faith and fear played out in every trench, every ward, every whispered conversation between nurses watching men bleed out or recover. By 1945, the truth was undeniable. Germany could no longer sustain its wounded. Hospitals overflowed, supplies vanished, and despair became endemic. The Americans, meanwhile, carried their system all the way to the Rhine, their hospitals expanding like living organisms behind the advancing front. For the German nurses who had seen both worlds, the contrast was seared into memory. They had watched men die needlessly under scarcity. They had walked through American hospitals where abundance was a weapon. The strategic and psychological impact was absolute. It was not only the clash of tanks and planes that broke the Reich. It was the crushing realization, carried by soldiers and nurses alike, that their enemy possessed a strength not of weapons alone, but of care. That knowledge, whispered in dark wards and shouted across radios, weighed heavier than iron. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the echoes of war lingered not only in the ruins of cities and the graves of soldiers, but in the memories of those who had seen what industrial warfare truly meant. Among the most searing memories were those carried by the German nurses who had walked, stunned, through the vast American hospitals of Normandy and beyond. They had lived the collapse of their own system, and they had witnessed the overwhelming scale of their enemies. What they saw was more than tents and cots. It was the future of war. For Germany, the lesson was bitter. Its armies had fought with unmatched skill and courage. Its tanks and aircraft had been marvels of engineering, but the Reich had failed to build the invisible backbone that sustained modern war. Hospitals were starved, medical supplies rationed, and wounded soldiers abandoned by a system that prized offense above endurance. The Reich had believed that victories could be won by firepower alone. It discovered too late that wars are won by the power to endure. For the Americans, the war confirmed what their leaders had suspected, that industrial organization was as decisive as any battlefield maneuver. The United States had created not only the world's largest army but the world's largest medical machine. In the process, it rewrote the meaning of survival in war. A soldier's odds of living after being wounded were higher than in any previous conflict, higher even than the Germans could imagine. That truth was not lost on those who survived because of it, nor on the enemy who witnessed it firsthand. The legacy stretched far beyond 1945. In the Cold War that followed, the American military embraced the lesson with zeal. Hospitals became mobile, integrated into the doctrine of rapid deployment. Medical evacuation, medevac, was refined into an art, helicopters whisking the wounded from battlefields in Korea and Vietnam in minutes, not hours. The chain of survival that had shocked German nurses in Normandy became the standard by which modern armies measured themselves. Technology only expanded the gap. Radios that once crackled with orders now carried digital signals across satellites. Blood plasma stored in crates became advanced transfusion systems. Antibiotics once scarce became routine. By the Gulf War of 1991, American commanders boasted that their medical infrastructure could deliver survival rates even higher than in World War II. The principle was the same as in Normandy: connection, speed, and the certainty that no soldier would be abandoned. For Germany, humbled and divided after its defeat, the lesson was quietly absorbed into its own post-war doctrine. The Bundeswehr, created in the 1950s, modeled its medical corps not on the improvisation of the old Wehrmacht, but on the precision of the American system. The nurses who had seen both worlds carried their stories into a new era, reminders of how scarcity had broken them, and how abundance had astonished them. The larger truth, however, transcended nations. It was a truth about war itself. The American hospitals of World War II had proven that survival was not only a humanitarian act but a weapon of strategy. Every soldier saved was a soldier who could fight again. Every nurse supplied was a nurse who could preserve morale. Every hospital erected was a fortress of endurance as vital as any bunker or trench. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, one of Germany's highest commanders, admitted it after the war with bitter candor: "We built better tanks, but you built tanks that worked together." The same could be said of hospitals. Germany built surgeons of skill and nurses of dedication, but America built a system that connected them, supplied them, and multiplied their strength. That system, more than any single invention, had stunned the captured nurses who walked through its wards. For those women, the memory never faded. They had lived through both extremes, the scarcity of barns filled with dying men, and the abundance of American tent cities glowing with light. They knew that the contrast was more than a matter of comfort. It was the measure of a nation's will to endure. In their silence, in their shocked glances, lay the acknowledgement that Germany had lost not only the war of weapons but the war of survival. The lesson remains as urgent now as it was in 1944. Modern armies no longer measure victory solely in the destruction they inflict, but in the resilience they sustain. Hospitals, supply lines, and communication networks decide wars as surely as tanks and planes. The American hospitals of World War II were not accidents of wealth. They were deliberate instruments of strategy, proof that mercy itself can be harnessed as a weapon. In the end, the stunned German nurses became unwilling witnesses to a truth that outlived the Reich they served in modern war. The power to heal is as decisive as the power to kill. The canvas wards of Normandy, glowing with light in the night, were more than hospitals. They were monuments to a new kind of warfare, one where connection outweighed isolation, where abundance crushed scarcity, and where speed and organization defeated even the most fearsome armor. In the great silence after the war, as Europe rebuilt from ashes, and the world braced for a new age of conflict, one lesson stood carved into history, like a scar across the battlefield. In modern war, connection outweighs firepower, and speed defeats armor. December 12, 1944. The Northern Philippines. Rain lashes down in sheets, turning the soil into rivers of mud. The thick canopy of jungle muffles the distant thunder of artillery, the boom rolling like a storm trapped between mountains. In a clearing barely the size of a tennis court, a handful of American GIs crouch low in water-filled foxholes, rifles balanced across the edge, eyes searching the dripping green gloom. They have been here for days, holding the line against Japanese patrols that appear suddenly, vanish silently, then strike again with bayonets and grenades. Every night is a test of endurance. Every dawn brings another rainstorm of steel. And yet, within this hell, something utterly unexpected happens, something that would sear itself into the memory of enemy and ally alike. Smoke rises not only from gun barrels but from dented steel mess kits. A thin, savory aroma curls through the trench line. Despite the mud, despite the shells, the Americans are passing around steaming mugs of soup, hot, hearty, seasoned from cans dragged through mud and blood. They eat together, shoulder to shoulder, sharing spoons, offering sips to those too exhausted to lift their own. Some laugh between mouthfuls, others sigh with relief. It is a ritual, almost sacred, and watching through the dripping leaves, hidden Japanese scouts stare in disbelief. To them, it is unthinkable. Hot soup. In the middle of a battlefield, soldiers who still eat like men at home. The jungle is alive with contrasts. To the Japanese infantrymen, war has long since stripped away comfort. Their rations are rice balls hardened to stone, dried fish that stinks in the heat, meager portions carried in cloth bags that rot after weeks in the rain. They boil what little they have over fires made of damp sticks, often too weak to cook properly. Food is survival, but barely. There is no warmth in it, no comfort, no camaraderie. Each soldier eats quickly, silently, like an animal guarding scraps. Hunger gnaws constantly, a sharper weapon than any American bullet. And so when Japanese eyes see the Americans ladling steaming broth into chipped cups, the sight cuts deep. For the GIs, soup is more than calories. It is memory. It is the taste of home carried across oceans. Companies like Campbell's and Heinz have filled endless crates with condensed soups, powdered mixes, and tins of beans. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps ensures they arrive at the front, sometimes on mule trains, sometimes airdropped in crates that shatter against rocks but still deliver edible warmth. A simple fire built from gasoline-soaked rags heats the liquid, and soon a trench transforms from a hole in the ground to something resembling a kitchen table. Soldiers slurp, joke, pass cigarettes and feel, if only for minutes, that they are not trapped in the maw of war, but sitting in a diner back in Kansas or Pennsylvania. The Japanese, indoctrinated in Bushido and sacrifice, cannot fathom this luxury. In their doctrine, comfort is weakness, endurance is honor. A soldier's stomach is expected to shrink, his spirit to expand. To see Americans dining like men rather than starving like beasts seems not just strange but insulting. Reports filter up the chain. The enemy fights with full bellies, and worse, they eat hot food in trenches under fire. To men who march until their feet bleed and drink from stagnant puddles, this detail becomes a legend of sorts. The Americans are supplied beyond imagination, and morale, that invisible weapon, flows as surely as the soup itself. Night falls again over the drenched mountains. The air hums with insects and the groans of the wounded. Somewhere in the distance a bugle call echoes, its notes trembling against the jungle walls. The Americans settle into their foxholes, stomachs warmed, nerves steadied, radios crackle with updates. Cigarettes glow in cupped hands. The smell of soup lingers, masking the stench of sweat and cordite. In the shadows beyond, Japanese scouts report back, whispering of this strange ritual, shaking their heads in quiet disbelief. How could an army so careless with comfort, so extravagant with warmth, still fight so ferociously? The answer lies not just in logistics, but in philosophy. For the Americans, war is fought with machines, with industry, with a supply chain stretching back to factories and farms that never sleep. Each GI is a consumer of that industrial might. Each trench becomes a node in a vast network, supported by trains, ships, and trucks that carry not only ammunition and gasoline, but soup, coffee, chocolate, and bread. War is not just survival, it is sustained by abundance, and that abundance becomes a weapon as potent as any rifle. The Japanese soldier, hardened though he is, realizes this difference with a mix of awe and despair. He fights for an empire that cannot feed him properly, an army that demands sacrifice but provides little. His enemy fights with hot soup in the trenches, laughter on their lips, and the scent of home wafting even in the heart of hell. The image is haunting, unforgettable, for in war morale is often the dividing line between endurance and collapse, and nothing builds morale like the warmth of a shared meal, steaming in the cold mud of a battlefield. By dawn, the rain eases, mist rolls across the hills, patrols prepare once more, rifles cleaned, bayonets fixed. But in the memory of those who survived that night, it is not only the clash of steel that lingers, it is the sight of Americans, huddled together in the mud, sipping soup as though the world outside had not dissolved into fire. It is an image that seems surreal, almost impossible, yet it is real, and it becomes a metaphor for the war itself. One side starved, driven by willpower and sacrifice, the other fed, sustained by industry and comfort. The battlefield of the Philippines, like so many in the Pacific, was a crucible of endurance. Men fought until their uniforms rotted from their bodies, until disease claimed more than bullets, until hunger hollowed them to shadows. Yet through it all, the Americans kept a ritual alive, of warmth, of nourishment, of camaraderie. Soup, simple and unassuming, became a symbol of power. To the Japanese, it was unthinkable. To the Americans, it was necessary. And in that gulf of perception lay the seeds of a truth that would shape the outcome of the Pacific War. By early 1944, the Pacific War had reached a brutal crescendo. The United States and its allies were advancing steadily across island chains, prying fortified Japanese garrisons from coral reefs, volcanic ridges, and jungle mountains. Each step forward came at staggering cost. Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, Peleliu, names that would be carved into memory through blood and sacrifice. For the Japanese Empire, the tide had shifted. What once was a sweeping surge across the Pacific had become a desperate, grinding defense. The Imperial Japanese Army, hardened by years of campaigns in China and Southeast Asia, now faced a relentless foe whose industrial might seemed boundless. The American soldier arriving in the Pacific in 1944 entered an environment as alien as the surface of another planet. The air was heavy with humidity, filled with the ceaseless buzz of insects. Jungle rot ate through boots. Malaria stalked the ranks. Mud was as much an enemy as bullets. Yet these soldiers came armed not only with rifles, machine guns, and artillery. They carried a hidden advantage that their Japanese counterparts could neither match nor fully understand. It was not a weapon of steel or powder, but a philosophy, embedded in logistics, the conviction that a soldier must be fed, clothed, and supplied even on the edge of hell.